Clauses. First, what is a clause? A clause is any group of words that has its own subject and verb. And we contrast that with a phrase, which is a group of words which does not have a subject and verb. But a clause does have its own subject and verb. It's very easy to tell the difference. If we look at these three lines here, before we ate dinner clearly has a subject and a verb. We is the subject and ate is the verb. This expression, however, before dinner has no such subject and verb. This is a phrase. This one also has a subject and verb, we and get, and therefore it is a clause. And that's all you need to know to distinguish between phrases and clauses. Now there's two kinds of clauses. We talk about independent clauses and dependent clauses. Independent clauses are complete sentences. They can stand on their own and hence their name, independent. Dependent clauses are incomplete. They are not complete sentences. They cannot stand on their own. The only way they can exist is if they are attached to an independent clause. Now, both dependent and independent clauses will have their own subject and verb, but dependent clauses cannot stand on their own. So take this line of scripture here. When the 7th month came, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. And you can see that the dependent clause, when the 7th month came, if you say that to yourself, you can even hear it. It just doesn't make sense all on its own. When the 7th month came, we expect something additional. And that's the independent clause. The people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. That is the independent clause. And the dependent clause is when the 7th month came. And when the 7th month came cannot stand on its own. It must be attached to the independent clause in order for it to exist. So, to continue this then, when the 7th month came is a dependent clause. It is dependent on the next clause, which is independent. And some people find it helpful to think of dependent clauses as children. Some of us will even claim dependence on our tax form. Children don't live on their own. They live and exist in relationship to their parents. And dependent clauses are the same thing. They can only exist if they are attached to a dependent or an independent clause. Now the key element of difference then between a dependent clause and an independent clause is the dependent marker word, which is often abbreviated DMW. The dependent marker word is called such because it marks out the beginning of a dependent clause. Now, we already learned in this course that relative pronouns can be dependent marker words. Now we're going to add another, and that is a subordinating conjunction. Actually, we've seen both of these words already in this class. And you'll know that there are a long list of subordinating conjunctions. They're not easy to memorize. But the relative pronouns are very easy to memorize. Who, whom, which, that, whose, and what are the relative pronouns. And the rest of the dependent marker words, you can assume then, are going to be subordinating conjunctions. So why does the dependent marker word matter? Well, because if the dependent marker word is a subordinating conjunction, you can assume the clause is likely to be adverbial, and likewise if it's a relative pronoun, you can assume it to be adjectival. Now there is a third option. It can be substantival, but you'll always know when a dependent clause is substantival because, like any other substantival word or phrase or anything, it will be one of the noun functions. It'll be a subject, an object, a predicate nominative, or an apposition, something like that. So to look at some examples here we have a text of Scripture, and you'll see the underlined are both dependent clauses. Both dependent clauses are introduced by relative pronouns, and the words bold-faced in red there are relative pronouns, and they're dependent marker words, which means they're marking the beginning of a dependent clause. And this first one, that was at Gibeon, is telling us about place. It's modifying the noun place. And which Moses the servant of the Lord had made in the wilderness is telling us about tent. It's modifying the noun tent. So those are both dependent clauses functioning adjectively, and we call them relative clauses because they begin with relative pronouns. Another text of Scripture here, notice the dependent marker word for this dependent clause is a subordinating conjunction, which means that we expect it to be adverbial. And indeed it is. Should have been is the main verb of the independent clause here. Of the independent clause is in black. The dependent clause in red. is modifying this verb should have been. And the dependent marker word is if, which is a subordinating conjunction. Another dependent marker word here, when, which is marking off the beginning of this dependent clause, when I heard their outcry in these words. This is a verse from Nehemiah. And again, the dependent marker word is a subordinating conjunction, hence the clause is adverbial, which actually probably would be pretty easy for you to recognize because you remember the adverbial questions, how, when, where, and why. And this dependent clause is clearly answering the question when he was very angry, when I heard their outcry in these words. So that helps you identify the function of that dependent clause.